finding out who our guests are. We have a very nice, big guest list tonight. I would remind you, as I said at the beginning, if you have someone who is your guest tonight, that's great. But Dave, standing back there slaving away, keeping track of things, would greatly appreciate if you can reimburse, not reimburse him, reimburse the club by bringing $33 to him before you leave tonight. We're trying to make sure we keep our funding, our books balanced. So once again, if you have a guest, and since we're asking if you have a guest, I'm going to ask Andy to start going around from table to table, offering an opportunity. And I know we have a guest at this table. Len, have we met your guest previously?
I have previously met my wife Linda for about 50 years. I'm getting sick of it, but you know, you do. No, it's my wife Linda, and maybe Norm. There you go.
Yeah. I know we're clear on that table. What about any guest? Barbara, you have a guest?
Yes, my wonderful, thank you, my wonderful spouse of many, the most patient man in the world, Jim Walters.
Yeah. And I understand that Jim has now fully completed the trail. I'm drawing a blank on that, but it's 500 miles, and Jim talked to us about that a couple years ago. He has now made the full, So over at this table over here, I see faces that I do not recognize. So.
Well, I'd like to introduce Chris Schlegel, who's sitting opposite me and who's been a long-time Kalamazoo resident and a delightful conversationalist. So I'm hoping that she will come with us to many more of these events.
Thank you. And Frank has guests.
Well, as long as this is the only microphone working, I seem to be pretty wired up tonight. But I have two guests who are frequently wired up, but not tonight maybe. To my far left, Terry O'Connor, with whom I taught for a number of years at Spring Arbor University. We got to know each other best there in recent years. And then Art Riley, Dr. Art Riley, whom some of you may know as a physician from the east region of our area. And and both of them have at one time or another been fellow residents with me at the Marlboro.
Good. Welcome. And I see some unfamiliar faces at this particular table as well. So Connie, your guest?
Hi, my guest is our new member, Jacqueline Bannigan. She's a math teacher at Kalamazoo Central.
Very good.
Welcome, sweetie.
That takes care of all of our guests. All right. Well, thank you all for being here again. We have a very timely program this evening if you follow international news. I cannot take any responsibility for scheduling this program now, but Frank Cody is here to talk to us tonight. Frank has some very relevant experience in speaking about the topic we have tonight, which is, for those of you, I'm sure you all know, the Brazilian election, presidential election just took place a couple weeks ago. Frank worked for 10 years in São Paulo in Brazil as the director of an international school. Not surprisingly, in those 10 years there, he picked up Portuguese, and he is bilingual in Portuguese. He has a long history as an educator, an instructor, both in the Detroit area, at Spring Arbor College, as he just mentioned. He has been to Brazil any number of times after his 10 years down in Brazil. He has spoken to groups in Brazil about American political developments, and he is a co-author of several books. He has been a superintendent and a high school principal at various schools. He taught at several Detroit area colleges and universities. And he is here tonight perhaps to provide some insight into what has happened and how this all may play out over the course of the next few. I'm not quite sure when the inauguration of the new president will take place, but Frank will fill that in, and hopefully, it will go much more peacefully than recent presidential elections in some other countries that we're familiar with.
Thank you.
Frank.
I think I have it on me, so good, it's working. Well, Tom is very generous in his introduction, and I have to admit that we went through this very quickly. So the one thing I would like to disclaim is, having spent 10 full years in Brazil, I was a director of an international school there, a bilingual school, for 2 years. But then I went back to Brazil over a period of 10 years doing various kinds of consulting works, presentations, and that was my most recent time in Brazil, which was 1997 to 2007, and gave talks or programs or small schools on various subjects and had various audiences in Brazil. And it gave me a chance to continue to practice my Portuguese, which I felt that I was doing pretty well at. Oh, by the way, I mentioned Portuguese. So what do you know about the language Portuguese in terms of South America as opposed to Spanish in South America? Is there anything that comes to mind that might be surprising to people that are part of the audience here that you know about those two languages? What's that? Well, not quite. Mostly in Brazil. Definitely mostly in Brazil. But what most people don't know when they think of South America is the fact that more people in South America speak Portuguese than Spanish. So if you remember nothing else from my talk, try to remember that one. You can use that as something to bring to your next party, right? That's it. So tonight we're going to talk about the election that I think a number of you, at least, maybe most of you, heard about, that had its final round a la Georgia last week with Lula Inácio, or Luis Inácio Lula da Silva, commonly known as Lula, facing off with Jair Bolsonaro. Jair Bolsonaro, the president of Brazil for the last 4 years. Lula being a candidate for that same election in 2018 that he was going to run against Bolsonaro. But a little funny thing happened on the way to the forum. He was convicted of a crime and sent to jail. So in the 2018 election, he wasn't around to bother Jair Bolsonaro, who went to victory. Now, what we're going to be looking at tonight are two very different men who have two very different visions for Brazil, who just went through two elections, the qualifying election, the final election, both of which were considerably closer than the pundits had thought they were going to be. And as I say, they went through 2 rounds. Now, rather than my trying to give you a vocal description at this point of, and let me make sure I can enter the next one here. I'm just learning this, I suppose. Yep. Okay. Good. Okay. I decided to use a very good video that I found to give you more of a background than I can give just by viva voce. So if we get to this, I'm pushing on what you told me to push on. It's not, sorry.
I think our battery died. All right, there's your.
Okay, I can go up that way? All right, I hope. We checked this out before dinner, so it'll come together. We got an expert here.
Oh.
No, I don't think
That's not right.
we need my PowerPoint presentation. Yeah. I'm gonna stand back here.
everybody loves that sound, doesn't they?
Por amor de Dios. Como?
All right, we'll try this. How about this? Oh, what? Start your free trial. What?
There we are. We're back to that.
There
Ah,
we
now
Okay.
we connected. Yes, we are.
go. All right.
Okay, now don't go to sleep during the film, boys and girls.
Let's talk about the race to become Brazil's next president. It's a contest that really comes down to just two men. The current president, Jair Bolsonaro,
He is seen as the Trump of the tropics.
and former president Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva.
He is both the most loved and the most hated politician in Brazil, maybe seconded by Jair Bolsonaro.
Lula's ahead in the polls, and the big question is whether he can win outright in the first round. He'll need more than 50% of votes to do that, or it'll go to a second round runoff. And if Bolsonaro loses, it doesn't look like he'll go quietly.
Não é uma luta da esquerda contra a direita. É uma luta do bem contra o mal. E nós vamos vencer essa luta.
He's already been talking about election fraud.
Bolsonaro has challenged the very validity of the electoral process. He keeps flirting with a coup. Sometimes he says it explicitly, sometimes he just hints at it.
So who are these two rivals? And why are Brazilians so divided over them? In some ways, Bolsonaro and Lula represent a right versus left-wing rivalry, but there's also so much more going on. And a good place to start is the early 2000s. Lula became president in 2003 and served 2 terms until 2010. He was a former union leader and Brazil's first working-class president. It was a time when the economy was booming, and for a lot of Brazilians, life got better.
There was the commodities super cycle that made a lot of dollars come to Brazil. His administration also did a lot of measures to protect low-income families.
Lula left office with an 83% approval rating. The next president, Dilma Rousseff, was from the same Workers' Party, the PT, and was seen as Lula's hand-picked successor.
President Rousseff, Dilma Rousseff, was enjoying pretty high approval rates at the time, and all of a sudden Brazil went into this long turmoil. And one of the big questions that many people ask is, what happened to Brazil after 2013?
Well, a couple of big things happened. First, the economy turned. There was a recession, people were losing their jobs, and prices were going up. And then there was Operation Car Wash, what became a huge corruption investigation that went on for years. It basically uncovered a multi-billion-dollar money laundering and bribery scheme linked to the state-run oil company Petrobras.
They revealed during the car wash operation that there was an involvement of pretty much every single major political party in Brazil with corruption scandals.
That included Lula himself. In 2017, he was convicted of money laundering and corruption and ended up with a 12-year prison sentence, although he was released after about 18 months. Lula maintained he'd done nothing wrong and that all the charges were politically motivated. And by the way, the Supreme Court later annulled his convictions. So let's look at the last presidential election in 2018. It was a really messy time in Brazil. The economy was recovering from a deep recession, the corruption scandal was going strong, and violent crime was on the rise. And that's where Jair Bolsonaro comes in. He's a former army captain who became a member of Congress in 1990. He wasn't really a political heavyweight, but he got a lot of attention for making statements like this.
Eu sou favorável à tortura, tu sabe disso. E o povo é favorável a isso também.
Maria do Rosário, fica Há poucos dias tu me chamou de estuprador no Salão Verde e eu falei que não ia estuprar você porque você não merece. Fica aqui para ouvir. Eu quero uma polícia civil e militar que, em defesa do povo, atire para matar.
Now, he ran for president in 2018 on a platform all about making Brazil great again. He was up against Lula, who was campaigning from jail until he was barred at the last minute. And Bolsonaro won.
Bolsonaro seemed to be, as early as 2016 or 17, the man who embodied all the frustration and all the bad blood that was going around Brazil at the time. And his platform was music to many people's ears at that point. So he would say that he was an anti-system candidate, he was fighting corruption.
He has mastered political communication on social media like no one else in Brazil, especially no one on the left. And he has successfully shaped a lot of conversations in the country. That's what allowed him to go from backbencher to a competitive presidential candidate to being the president.
Now, some Brazilians look back at the last 4 years of Bolsonaro as president and see disaster. Many blame him for not taking COVID seriously. More than 680,000 Brazilians died, the second highest death toll in the world. Then there's his environmental record. Deforestation has accelerated under Bolsonaro, and he's rejected the idea that Brazil has any special role to play in the fight against climate change.
É uma falácia dizer que a Amazônia é patrimônio da humanidade e um equívoco, como atestam os cientistas, afirmar que a Amazônia, a nossa floresta, é o pulmão do mundo.
And then there's the accusation that Bolsonaro has deliberately weakened state institutions.
Bolsonaro has moved very quickly ever since the very beginning of his tenure to undermine and to hollow out political institutions and bureaucracies, especially those who might put obstacles or limits to the actions of some private interest groups that have supported Bolsonaro from day one.
But a lot of Brazilians really like what Bolsonaro stands for. He's seen as more supportive of the private sector, and he's got a lot of support among people with more conservative social values.
Deus, pátria, família e liberdade. Brasil acima de tudo. Deus acima de todos.
He projects himself as a man of faith, of Christian values, who wants a traditional family, who's against abortion. Those that vote for Bolsonaro, they don't want people to be talking about gender identity in school. They don't want abortion, definitely. They don't want drugs to be legalized. They'd rather not have gay rights. These people, there are people that believe in this agenda.
So in this election, with Bolsonaro up against Lula, you've got this epic political showdown. Both of them are huge personalities, both are controversial in their own way, and both of them inspire love and hate from different parts of society. But putting the political theater aside for a moment, the big issue for most Brazilian voters is the economy, because a lot of people are struggling right now. More than half the population is food insecure, even though Brazil is one of the world's biggest food producers. And prices are going up for food and fuel, just like in many other countries.
Nós sofremos, meu filho, não é brincadeira não. Ela vai para a rua, arruma lá, pede, os amigos ajuda, tudo dá você. Tem mês que aperta mais, né? Tem mês que aperta, mas tem a semana que melhora mais e outras é mais fraca e assim vai.
Economic conditions in Brazil have been extremely challenging, especially for lower income voters who are the majority of the Brazilian population. So that's why the economy is the number one, number two, and number three priority for voters.
So both candidates are trying to convince voters that they're the man to deliver on the economy. Bolsonaro has been pointing out that inflation and unemployment have gone down, and in July he got Congress to approve $7.6 billion in emergency aid. That includes a 50% increase in monthly cash payments for Brazil's poorest until the end of the year. As for Lula, he's been pushing the message that the economy was much better back when he was president.
O país que eu deixei é país que o povo tem saudade. É o país do emprego. É o país em que o povo tinha o direito de viver dignamente, de cabeça erguida nesse país. E esse país vai voltar.
He's able to tap into people's perception that their lives were better back in 2010. And the fact that is that it was better. People's lives were definitely better.
Se ele entrar, vai ser beleza. Aí a gente vai poder voltar a comer carne. Igual com o Bolsonaro, a gente vai voltar a comer pé de frango.
Lula has basically run on a platform, I know how to do stuff, I have done in the past, and I'm not Bolsonaro.
But that works the other way around too, with some people supporting Bolsonaro just because he's not Lula.
There are people who vote for Bolsonaro because they hate Lula. These are people that are furious at the corruption scandals, and they feel that they're now having to pick between a crazy guy and a robber. It's like, which one would I rather have?
All of this is creating a really tense election atmosphere. There's even been violence. 2 Lula supporters have been killed by Bolsonaro supporters, and Bolsonaro doesn't seem to be doing much to calm things down. He's been questioning the voting machines and setting up the idea that there could be fraud.
He's trying to sow distrust in the country's electronic voting system, which in almost 30 years has never faced one single credible fraud allegation. And Bolsonaro has swamped the Brazilian public discourse with vitriol. He has portrayed this electoral race as a battle between good and evil.
So there's a lot of nervousness in Brazil about the state of the country right now and where this election could take things.
What I feel about this election is like there's no hope for the future. It's more of an election like, let's avoid falling into a hole. So people are clinging on to what they think will be less worse and not something that will be better.
Sometimes I have the feeling that we have 2 separate and very different Brazils that no longer talk to each other.
Start Here breaks down the big news stories, and you can watch more of our episodes on Al Jazeera's YouTube channel, like this one about what's going on in Afghanistan 1 year after the Taliban took over.
Where I can go to the next slide. I should know that by now. Which one of them is it?
Oh, that's the video again. There we go.
All right, good. Well, I think you got a sense of what's been going on lately. If you didn't know already, I suspect a lot of this is, to some of you, not all that new. But when they talk about the fact, or when the woman talks about the fact there's no choice, I must say, in some ways, I would certainly feel that way, which I'll develop as we go on here. Something about Lula and his background. In 1980, Lula, after close to 40 years as a worker who was illiterate until the age of 10, who lost a thumb in the factory situation that he was working in when he was still a young teenager, and who certainly lived a life among the poor, had through the years afterwards become more interested in making things better, not only for himself, and he did continue his work, but for other people in situations like his own, and found himself ultimately being one of the founders, if not the founder, of a political party which was a powerful political party when I got to Brazil a few years later, in 1981 actually, it was 1 year later, but it was already one of the more important parties, the Workers' Party, the Partido de Trabalho. And so he was, as it says here, after the Workers' Party in 1980, he was very involved in that party, in the development of that party, growing that party into one of the 2 major parties in Brazil, by 2000. And he decided to run for president in the year 2002 and was elected into, as they pointed out in the video we just saw, into a pretty good economic scene. He did not come in the midst of a depression, but he came in with the environment being good, but he also, the greater environment, but also the legislative environment was good. The Workers' Party had developed close to a majority in both the Senate and the House, which is the federal, I should get this straight without having to look, the Chamber of Federal Delegates. And just to say a little bit about the Senate and the House in Brazil, first of all, a few years ago, there were 35 different political parties represented in both houses. And you say, what was going on with all those political parties? Well, part of it was they got some kind of a bonus from the government, which enabled them to spend some money. And so if they got together with a few other people and proclaimed themselves a party, they'd already have a campaign chest or whatever they're going to use it for. So that was one of the reasons. Now, they've gone into some legislation which has cut down the number of parties. So now we're talking about approximately 11 parties. And of course, they tend to get together on sides of issues so that you'll have some parties over here, some parties over there. But generally speaking, they're not fully ideological parties. You say, well, what does that party really believe? Well, they don't have an ideology that's that easy. The Workers' Party that Lula headed up had more of an ideology before things kind of fell apart from them, for them in the teens, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But Lula, after elected president and with that kind of support of Congress, he came in with a mandate from the people of 20% over his nearest rival. So he had things going for him quite well. And then the next election, almost the same 20% margin. And he could only run for 2 terms according to the Constitution. Now, there's a great deal of talk in 2010 about his getting the Constitution amended so that he could have a 3rd term. However, Lula himself, and who knows what his motivation was, decided that was not the way he was going to go. In fact, he said, I want to be loyal to the Brazilian Constitution the way it's written. So he stepped aside and was going to retire. And in fact, in some ways did. The question that came up with Lula was who was going to pay for his retirement? And who was going to pay for the place where he lived in his retirement? And so he was or wasn't a recipient of financial arrangements from the Petrobras company through their Operation Car Wash. I won't call it, I shouldn't say it's just Petrobras's Operation Car Wash, but it took place, and a lot of the briberies were coming through the car wash. And some of them may have been payments for favors received, and some would be payments for favors to be received. And a lot of his members of the Working Party were certainly guilty of the crimes as charged. Was Lula? Well, without going into the specifics, which would keep us here longer than I think we'd want to be, at the end you can say, who knows for sure? The courts said that he certainly was not tried by the correct court, which I think everybody realized that he got tried for expediency's sake in the court in Curitiba, which is a city to the south, instead of Brasilia, which is the capital city, where he lived. He had his residence there, not only worked there, but and so according to Brazilian law, you are not supposed to be tried outside of where you live. The other thing was that he didn't have a chance to work on his appeals. The time and but he was thrown pretty much right into prison. And by the way, he served in prison about 550 days. So I don't think he had a particularly cushy life as he was warming up for this try for the presidency. Okay, now let me see if I got this. Good. Okay, Now, so the description of what happened to him in that first presidential election, Bolsonaro was behind. Lula gets arrested and sent to prison, as I talked about. And then in 2018, Lula's out of the picture, and the interim president chose not to run again. And so what happened was that, the interim president only served for about a year, and Bolsonaro's opposition was another leader of the Workers' Party. So this is the successor to Lula, and apparently one that got by without any bribes. And despite that, and because there's a stronger sympathy for Bolsonaro, both on a positive sense, that people are liking what they're hearing, and a lot of things that you and I might not like what we hear, many people in Brazil did like what they heard. Maybe people in the United States would like the same things. And as they point out in that film, Bolsonaro, amazingly, because of his lack of background here, I think mainly through the help of his sons, who are very au courant with the technologies and social media, helped him along and made him kind of an idol to the social media crowd in Brazil. He went to Fortaleza, which is to the north. He'd never been there before. He goes to the airport. He comes off the plane, and there's this huge crowd waiting to meet him. They think, how does anybody know me in Fortaleza? Well, social media helped a lot in that case. And and finally, in this campaign, and you may know about this, the assassination attempt was made. Some people would say, well, it was staged. Well, it wasn't staged. It was a true assassination attempt. He ends up in the hospital for a few weeks. There's social media coming out of the hospital every day. He's talking to the nation. And plus there's a strong right-wing coalition in the legislature at this point. And there's a very strong movement towards him on the part of the white population of Brazil, and the black population stays on the side of the Workers' Party. But nonetheless, Bolsonaro wins pretty easily at this point. And so that moves us to our next presentation here. And I pretty much have gone through this already. Was Lula guilty? And I mentioned these things, and except the last one here, and that is he could go to jail again. This is not settled yet fully. He's out. He's able to run for president. He's able to become president, which he's become, or will become with the inauguration. However, when could he be put back in jail if that's what's ultimately going to happen? I don't know if it could happen as president. Maybe there's rules that wouldn't allow that, but I'm not sure of that. And I didn't read something that... Now, Bolsonaro with this last election, which, by the way, if I haven't described enough and you aren't familiar with it, the first election, which included at least one or maybe two more candidates, left Bolsonaro with 43% of the vote and Lula with 47%. No one had gotten to 50%. And that's why I compared it to Georgia. It's like the race that's going on down there now between Walker and, yeah, right. Okay, so what has Bolsonaro said after his final defeat by only 2 percentage points? He said something about we abide by the Constitution, but not in the sense that he's not challenging the vote. It's a very loose kind of answer to the question to anybody that's wondering, is he eventually going to protest this vote? Is he going to agree? Is he going to concede? He hasn't conceded yet, and we're getting to a couple weeks away from the election. So he's leaving a number of people guessing. Right after the election, the second election, there was an uprising in many of the states of Brazil, and there are 26 of those states, and there were truckers who were blocking roads, which was in sympathy with Bolsonaro. And he commented on the fact that they were out there, but he didn't tell them not to be out there. But they seem to be waiting. Well, what are you going to do? And nothing happens, so there are not any trucks out there blocking the roads at this point. So, I mentioned this here. I always get ahead of myself here. So what was Bolsonaro doing? At the bottom of that paragraph, I say taking the temperature of the situation, maybe trying to find out, do I have enough support to be able to pull this off and object to the vote count? But as they point out in that no one has ever objected to the Brazilian vote count. There's never been any fraud. That's amazing to say there's never been. I mean, we always say, well, it's that significant. Well, never as far as they're concerned. Okay, one other thing that might not have come through, but might have to some extent, is the fact that both candidates, because of the nature of Brazil, certainly, are people who would not be candidates if they weren't religious people in whatever way you want to define that. But you better define it in a way that appeals to a number of Brazilians. Because Brazil is, in many respects, I think you can call it a religious country. And there are, in the Christian, which is by far the largest of the largest religions, are different Christian religions. Lula has been a basically traditional in many ways, if you can be in Brazil, Catholic, closer to what we would know as a traditional Catholic. And Bolsonaro, who certainly claims to be Catholic, as there are a whole lot of people do in Brazil, because it's a Catholic country, but Bolsonaro has had some problems staying with Catholic teaching in terms of his own personal life. He's divorced and married. He's in his third marriage. And of course, divorce is something that is frowned on in Brazil, generally speaking, and creates some difficulties with the Catholic Church as to whether this man is truly still part of the Catholic Church or not. So, but without going into any of that, Lula has been pretty straight. He's on his second wife, but he's a widower, so a little different situation. Excuse me. Oops, no wonder, upside down. Okay, so just to talk about Lula's Catholicism a little more. His brand of Catholicism, while going along with the rules in general, would be considered by us, I think, and I'm a Catholic myself, but being a liberal and progressive Catholic on that side of things. And he does have the support of the Brazilian bishops, which in some people's voting procedures are something that they might consult. What are the bishops saying about him? And more progressive actors within the Catholic Church, priests, brothers, or lay people, as the Franciscan order is in Brazil, and are focused more on social justice issues and concerns of that sort, have come out very strongly in support. I think stronger than in terms of presidential candidates in the United States. I don't think you found any, that I can think of, any Catholic organization that ever definitively came out for either Trump or Biden in the last election. I'm unfamiliar. Not to say people wouldn't speak privately about it, but to make public announcements, at least it would be very rare. Abortion was a important issue, and as it turned out in the election. And let me just say that basically they have a pretty conservative law in Brazil that eliminates abortions except in the case of rape, incest, or the life of the mother. So, and that ultimately Lula, although seeming to, from some of the things he said, to be moving towards a more liberal position, I think in order to keep himself within the ballpark, decided at the end that he was sticking with that rather conservative position on abortion. And Bolsonaro, as I've talked about, claims to be a Roman Catholic. Depends on who in the church you're talking about. Now, in his third marriage, the first two ended in divorce. The first one, by the way, he had 3 children. This latest marriage, I believe he's had 2. and important because if we have time, I can talk about his sons and what a big part they played in helping Bolsonaro to his position now, not just in terms of learning the technology and social media, but in a variety of ways, such as when his youngest son, to get back on Bolsonaro's behalf for the mistreatment he felt at the hands of his first wife, the youngest son, or the middle son, the one who is actually one of the son of the mother, decided to go up against her. She was on the Rio City Council. It was a big deal for her. She'd been elected to the city council in Rio, and a good political position for her. Well, the son decided, and probably did on his own to some extent, but with the father's encouragement, to run against his mother for that position as a city council member from the city of Rio, and at 17 years old, won the election. Here's to you, Mom. So anyway, he's with his third wife, and that is Bolsonaro, not Lula now, Bolsonaro. And he is given support by a number of ministers within the Protestant realms in Brazil, and specifically one who's kind of the, I'm thinking back to ministers of Billy Graham of Brazil in some ways, although certainly not as bright or as cogent as Brazil, I don't think. But it gave him a lot of support during the election, and on the radio, on television. And Bolsonaro claimed to be very much in the same camp that Lula was in, that is, very limited abortion possibilities. But then he spoke about the fact that his wife and he sat down to decide whether they should abort or not, and finally came to the conclusion that they shouldn't. But obviously, to a lot of people, if they're discussing it among themselves, they must not have quite as strong an opinion about when abortion is legitimate or not. This may seem like a side issue to us. I guess it can't after what we went through recently about abortion, but it certainly is in a different way, very central in Brazil. Now, Lula's in by a small margin. What is his challenge? What are the obstacles? Well, in that film, you saw that in terms of the economy that he inherited in his first presidency was a very strong economy. Things were going really well. He didn't have to work at that very hard. And in terms of political opposition, very strong in the legislature, the Workers' Party and aligned parties. There wasn't an authoritarian, conservative, reactionary group that occupied about half the chairs within the Brazilian legislature like there is today. So in terms of laws getting passed, he's not going to have an easy time of it. Now, the environment is a challenge. I won't say it's an obstacle, but one of the differentiating policies of these two men has had its effect in the area of the environment. For Bolsonaro, the Amazon was a gift not to the world, but to the Brazilian people in order that they might grow their economy. And they could grow it by cattle, and they could grow it by forestry, and tearing down the forests that were providing the lifelongs that we consider it to provide, or at least I think most of us do. And so he has a challenge there, but how can he bring this group that he can't just make fiats or dictates, how can he bring this group along? Foreign affairs, Lula is someone that a person like Barack Obama speaks very fondly of, and sees him as what we used to call at least a third world leader of great, and he did operate in that particular area well as in his days as president the first time around. And we could talk about the BRIC nations, which Brazil, Russia, India, and China, which were close in many ways to each other. A lot to be talked about there, but I'm not going to go into that all. But it will be difficult to see him achieving that kind of leadership in the world area that we have right now, compared to what was possible at the beginning of the 2000s. Just a quick look at, and this is the election up there. That's the map of Brazil. And the brown areas, which are, there's a lot of farm area there, and it's a lot of blacks live there. The brownish areas to the right, to the east. The darker the blue gets, the stronger the support for Bolsonaro. And these are white areas, tend to be more industrial in many ways. Surprised me a little that Sao Paulo was not maybe like Minas Gerais above it. Here's Sao Paulo right here, and there's Minas Gerais. Wasn't more neutral, as it were, because the darker it goes, the more towards, but it still was not Bolsonaro territory, it was Lula territory. Anyway, and looking at Bolsonaro, what's he got going for him? I think I mentioned mostly these 4 sons of his, 3 of whom at least are henchmen, majority in Congress, the precarious economy that Lula's going into, which is going to make people say, oh, geez, we should have had Bolsonaro. He dominates social media right now, and he gets a lot of support from the business community and other centers of power like that. That's it, folks. So, thank you. Questions? Comments? Yes, sir. It's next year. Yeah, I don't know the date. I should have looked it up. Yeah. Yes?
Are all political parties businesses and so that the members get rich?
Yeah, you know, Bolsonaro was, for example, was an army captain. And he never made a lot of money. In fact, he made a name of himself for himself by speaking out and writing about the fact that the soldiers don't get paid enough. And then he left, and he continued writing, and he goes to he was city commissioner for Rio for a year before his wife and his son and everything. But so he goes and gets into the legislature. Well, it's a cushy deal. He doesn't have to worry for the rest of his life. Got great benefits. He's got side gigs that he gets a little money from with the party. You're right. I mean, these parties are kind of businesses. And I won't try to make a comparison with U.S. parties, but you might find some similarities there. But maybe not as big as in Brazil. Thank you. Yes?
Frank, how big a role does Petrobras play in society, especially in terms of being a center of not only finance but of culture?
Well, it's still a big company, but they really went down in the estimation of Brazilians, and even the estimation of Brazilian government, when it was found out that they were giving all these bribes to people. That did play a role, and I couldn't tell you exactly, beyond that, but to say it played a role in the fact that with the Brazilian people in general, Petrobras is a bad name, and you can't get away from it because they're still important in the oil industry. But yeah.
Quite a presence down in Houston, where my daughter lives. Big Petrobras community in the Woodlands, just because they're there for sometimes extended periods of time to pick up their trade.
That's interesting.
In fact, I remember going to a restaurant, breakfast place, and telling my daughter, I said, boy, there are a lot of, I've never seen so many well-dressed and women going out for brunch, lots of bling among the Spanish community. She just looked at me like she said, Dad, that's not Spanish you're speaking, it's Portuguese. So, obviously, they're well-heeled.
Okay.
They have nice homes, and they go to private schools.
What city was it in that you were with her?
That's in Houston.
Okay, Houston. Okay.
Immediately north of Houston, where a lot of people live in the woodlands.
Okay. Yeah. Yes. Well, You know, what I would know about that, of course, is that we continued to keep up as well as we could good relationships through the last few years, which was certainly assisted by the fact that people found that Trump and Bolsonaro were people who got along very well, personally, philosophy, shared some of the goods and the bads that went on. I mean, and I don't know how many goods, but you know, some of the bad things that went on, they were. So on a personal level, now I don't know about, you know, where we are legislatively. I know that we provide them some amount of aid, but I don't, so I can't really answer beyond that. But I think of that link between Bolsonaro and Trump was very strong. We may. I really can't answer that question, but good question. Good question. Yes.
Bolsonaro will be claiming fraud?
I don't think Bolsonaro will claim fraud right now. I'd say that. But will he survive? You know, to me, happy as I am in many ways to see Lula win, I think he's got a terrifically difficult job. Plus the fact, although I don't know how much this is affecting him, but he's older. Eventually, you know, things can't have been easy being in jail for almost 2 years. That can't have helped your body that much. He doesn't seem frail, and he may be but that, on top of the fact he doesn't have the Congress on his side, I just think I don't know what's going to happen, but I'm not too optimistic like that lady reported in the film that we saw. Yes. Well, I think and this is something with Lula coming in, he will certainly reach out for collaboration with China in any way he can. And so I think China will be happy with this relationship, although things have changed in China so much since he was in too. I mean, you've got Xi having taken over the power there as he has. But I would still think that, what's the roads initiative the Chinese have? Belt and Road. Brazil is part of that right now. And so I doubt that he would, especially with the economy in the situation it's in. The other problem with China, though, China's economy is such right now that he could have a difficult time that's brought more difficult because China can't afford to purchase what they were able to purchase at one point. So it's not a plus. Yeah, Jim. Well, it certainly had been, and when Bolsonaro longed, and maybe still longs, for the days of the military dictatorship, and I think in a lot of ways he tries to recreate that. In terms of the armed services themselves, though, I believe that they have backed off from politics in a pretty strong, definitive fashion. So I don't think there's any measure at all considered of taking over. On the other hand, if things really went to pot here, I guess it's always a possibility. No. That's a very interesting point. I never thought of that, and I don't have a quick. You can say, well, there are a lot of people that aren't doing badly, but we saw 50% have food problems. And so does anybody have a thought on that one as to why Brazil would not be a country they don't have political oppression that might be part of it. By the way, I didn't mention the fact that one of the bills that people liked that very much that Bolsonaro got passed was, or it may have been an edict, that people were allowed to have 60 weapons. And the way he believes you fight crime is you just kill them if they, if they knock on your door. Just get one of your 60 weapons out and blow their heads off. And Brazil is the most violent country in the world. More deaths there than we have, which is nice to say somebody has. But they have the guns to do it. A lot of firepower. Thank you. Enjoyed it.